Hello everybody, Sandre here. Welcome to another video in my IQ series. This video is going to be far longer than the other ones I've worked on. I guess you can say that this video will be split into two parts. The first part is going to talk about the notion of race, and why this notion is very much flawed and non-existent. The second part is going to be about the ideas of heredity and intelligence, and how this would correlate to so-called racial IQ. And you see, if you want to believe in racial IQ, the idea that there is a natural difference in IQ between different people of different races, you first have to believe in the concept of race. I will show you previous attempts in history that have failed, and current models that also fail the scientific test of time regarding the concept of race. Different elements of human variation and the complexity of interpretations of them are possibly in no other way as noticeable than by the differences between popular perceptions and scientific studies of so-called race. It is true humans offer diversity. However, any division of human populations into discrete categories or classifications, such as in race, is inherently unscientific. Many attempts at racial classifications can be seen in history, but all have not stood the passage of time and the critical investigations into them, as they were proved too rigid to account for either the tremendous variation found within individual so-called races, or the shared similarities between these supposedly different groups. Skin pigmentation, nose shape, and hair texture, and other physical characteristics made people throughout history try and classify humans into different races. It is undeniable that there is a diversity of human populations. However, this fact alone does nothing to help any process delineating specific so-called races, nor does it offer any practical or scientific value in studying human variation from a racial perspective. Now, unlike what some proponents argue, physical characteristics alone cannot be used for the purpose of dividing humans into readily discernible groups or races. Reason being that clearly bounded, racially distinct populations are not found and has never been found in the real world. To complicate things further, race is an inherently loaded term, in part because people use the word differently in different contexts. Physical characteristics and their classifications merely offers to label particular categories of phenomena arbitrarily selected by the researcher or the individual. It should be noted that both in present and in the past, people have used various racial classifications to categorize people, and they developed stereotypes about the behavior and mental abilities of these so-called different racial categories. Subsequently, these categories were used to justify for the discrimination and marginalization of certain groups. Now, self-identification regarding one's own so-called race can be used to gather census data. However, it should be noted that in every one of these papers, they clearly explain what the purpose is for the terminology of race and how it is defined within this paper. There is just no unified definition of the term race, and almost always it is entirely self-identified. Perhaps most importantly with regard to the current discussion, the reason for observed variation is not explained by racial classification. I will now begin this video by focusing on the early racial classifications, as faulty ideas have stemmed from them and are still widespread. In these early classifications, there is a varied criteria, and the numbers of races people have come up with have varied from as little as 3 to 30. Well, according to JF, there can be 600. What the fuck do we know? And that's the point. When looking at our history, there seems to be a consciousness throughout it regarding the difference between human beings. Archaeologists have found indications of racial classifications in the ancient depictions of people in, for instance, rock paintings. Later on, when civilizations had actual alphabets, we can see that in places like ancient Greece, Rome, the Near East, China, India, and in ancient Egypt, there was a variety of taxonomies used for different folks. It was unscientific, of course, and informal, but they did use classifications such as skin color and other physical features. However, it was very common to also use cultural characteristics. Now, you can go back as early as over 3000 BC, and there was a division in human population. This time, the arbitrary number is 4. There were 4 categories. Yellow for people of the East, black for Africans to the south, white for people of the north, and red for Egyptians. We can actually see the inheritance of this in biblical book of Genesis. And the sons of Noah that went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These are the 3 sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth overspread. Genesis 9:18-19. You see, the Shem and their descendants were the ancient Israelites. These traveled to the east and the south, while Japheth's descendants moved north. Ham is a word that originally means black, and so it referred to the black soil of the Nile Delta. The meaning of the word, however, was later on changed to describe the skin color of the descendants of Ham. Interesting thing is that at the end of Genesis, these descendants were essentially condemned to be servants unto their brethren. Genesis 9:25. This is the passage that many Westerners have cited as the justification for an entrenched system of racial discrimination during the era of slavery. Now we will move on to the early scientific studies of race. European explorers made contact with different peoples and cultures in the 1500s. As such, new classifications that were at the time seen as scientific began to appear. Earlier ideas based on a naive sense of essentialness and blood influenced a lot of these models of scientific racism. Skin colors of various people in the Middle East, Africa, and the Americas, as well as in Asia, were associated with particular essences, behaviors, and mental developments. These civilizations were measured by Europeans in comparison with their own, and as such they were designated as either barbaric and savage or civilized. With non-white people at the very bottom of the scale, there was a ranking system that was being established by Europeans in regards to differences in skin color. Slavery, colonization, and biased treatment followed with the rationale that this ranking system offered. A very good example of this is a Swedish scientist in the 1700s called Carolus Linnaeus. He did develop very valid taxonomic systems that are even today used to classify organisms. However, regarding his classification of humans, there is just no scientific justification whatsoever. You see, he divided human beings in 4 groups. Homo afer, which is black Africans. Homo asiaticus, which is yellow Asians. Homo americanus, red North Americans. And Homo europaeus, which is white Europeans. Previous scientific data played little role, however, in his classification of human beings. In fact, his model was almost entirely developed from earlier ancient and medieval hypotheses, as well as European perceptions of supposed superiority in regards to other savages and brutes. He saw Africans with their skin color as negligent and indolent. They were governed by caprice, you see. He also argued that the American Indians with their red skin were choleric, and they needed to be regulated by customs. Europeans, on the other hand, with their white fair skin, are inventive, acute, gentle, and governed by laws. These ideas were later on developed further to try and justify their continued existence as wholes by other scientists who actually looked at this skeptically were discovered. In 1781, Johann Blumenbach, who was a German scientist, had a racial classification system that he devised that is actually, even today, sometimes used in popular, unscientific discussions of race. You see, his divisions of humans is in the arbitrary number of 5. You have 5 distinct groups: Native American, Ethiopian, Malay, Mongolian, and Caucasian. They all correspond to the colors red, black, brown, yellow, and white. Most of his system was primarily based on skin color. He also saw facial features, such as hair color and the shape of the shin. He did emphasize that there was a clear unity to all of humanity. But the typologies that he developed were later on modified during the 19th and early 20th century to come up with the arbitrary number of free races of mankind: the Negroid, the Mongoloid, and the Caucasoid. This was done to justify things such as racism, colonialism, and slavery. Later on in history, Ernst Haeckel, Rudolf Virchow, Samuel Morton, and other physical anthropologists began to assert that the Caucasian race had a larger brain and higher intellectual capacity than non-Caucasians. And this is where we run into the limitations of early classification systems. It should be noted that all of these ideas regarding race and the idea of dividing humans into groups way predate Darwin and Mendel. As such, if one wants to propose these earlier models or even modern models that are inspired by these previous models regarding how to divide human beings, you cannot argue that they have any real biological basis. We simply didn't understand evolutionary biology and genetics when these models were devised. And as such, these models have not incorporated modern principles of heredity, natural selection, and population genetics. Let's look at Mendel, for instance, and his principle of independent assortment. You see, according to it, there is no link between physical traits in the process of reproduction and transmission of genetic material. In other words, you can't argue that there's a package of characteristics that is passed on to members of different so-called races. Blue eyes and blonde hair are not consistently found in tandem, which is also why hair texture and specific skin color are not very linked to each other at all. All these traits are independent of one another. As such, in different individuals, you have a varying combination of them. And this brings us to a very important point. Variation in the combination of traits makes it impossible to classify races according to a well-defined criteria that holds for entire populations. Modern researchers share the burden of discovering, just like the early scientists, the fundamental problem in distinguishing so-called race. There are no discrete divisions. A lot of characteristics simply exhibit a spectrum of one extreme to another. This is a phenomena called continuous variation. But I know what some people are going to say. This is the continuum fallacy. No, it is not. You simply cannot have a spectrum without extreme ends. That is true. But since these extreme ends are found in individuals, this cannot be extrapolated to a bigger level of populations, meaning that populations fall within the spectrum, not at the ends. This is not a fallacy, this is just how reality works. Now, if we want to use a primary criterion, such as skin color, for determining so-called race, how then are we supposed to divide so-called race? Any boundary you draw is entirely arbitrary. The simple truth is that since these differences are not readily measurable, this proves that race does not constitute a fundamental division within the human species. With the accumulation of scientific data, there is an increasingly more complicated image that is being resolved. Boundaries are becoming more obscure. There is also an attempt by some race realists to argue that continuous variation is a form of interbreeding or mongrelization. The basic logic of this claim is that at some point in the past, there were so-called pure races. And since there's interbreeding, the lines separating one race from another have become blurred. The naivete of these people proposing such an idea is quite staggering. There is a tremendous amount of migration throughout human history, and intermixing between what you would determine as races have always happened, and they have to be accounted for. It is true that gene flow were more restricted in the past in some groups than in others. But human populations have always interbred, meaning that even if you were to jump back 300 years, 3,000 years, 30,000 years, it would have been impossible to distinguish during any time period any different races. Some might say, what about geography? There had been a recognition of the arbitrary nature of racial classifications in the mid-20th century by the scientific community. And so, the people who still wanted to hold on to the idea of race in some manner began to take on a more biological method and approach. Unlike earlier attempts, they didn't rely on single arbitrarily defined characteristics, such as nose structure, hair color, or skin color. When they developed their new systems, they focused on influences from evolutionary sources, perhaps geographically isolated human populations. After all, populations have been and are still to some degree isolated by natural barriers, such as deserts, mountains, oceans, you name it. The reasoning was that most of these barriers for most people in every population led to people marrying and having children within their own gene pool. Stanley Garn, for instance, has a taxonomy where he divides humans into 9 geographical races: Polynesian, Micronesian, Melanesian, Papuan, Asiatic, Australian, Indian, European, Amerindian, and African. As time progressed, he also created smaller local races and microraces. The approach by Garn, which was sought to frame a classification of human races in evolutionary terms, was pointed out by critics that even these divisions imply a stronger similarity among the so-called races than actually exist. There is an exhibition of great amount of variation in some of Garn's supposed races. For example, the so-called Mediterranean race, which would extend from the Saudi Arabian Peninsula thousands of miles to Morocco, make it difficult to in any way imagine this culturally diverse group as a discrete breeding population. What's funny about it as well is that, as I've pointed out before, both in this video and in others, the variation contained within this Mediterranean group is actually greater than the difference between this Mediterranean group and other groups that he classified. Once again showing that even this more modern attempt fails miserably at dividing people into races. Which brings us to the Human Genome Project. This project was initiated back in 1990, and it wasn't completed until the beginning of the 2000s. It was a 13-year-old joint effort coordinated by the US Department of Energy and the National Institutes of Health. The primary objective was a daunting task: mapping genetic loci of all the approximately 20,000 to 25,000 human genes, and to determine the sequence of the estimated 3 billion base pairs that make up human DNA.
Good morning. The moment we are here to witness was brought about through brilliant and painstaking work of scientists all over the world, including many men and women here today. It was not even 50 years ago that a young Englishman named Crick and a brash, even younger American named Watson first discovered the elegant structure of our genetic code. More than 1,000 researchers across 6 nations have revealed nearly all 3 billion letters of our miraculous genetic code. I congratulate all of you on this stunning and humbling achievement. With this profound new knowledge, humankind is on the verge of gaining immense new power to heal. Genome science will have a real impact on all our lives, and even more, on the lives of our children. It will revolutionize the diagnosis, prevention, and treatment of most, if not all, human diseases. In coming years, doctors increasingly will be able to cure diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, diabetes, and cancer by attacking their genetic roots. After all, I believe one of the great truths to emerge from this triumphant expedition inside the human genome is that in genetic terms, all human beings, regardless of race, are more than 99.9% the same. What that means is that modern science has confirmed what we first learned from ancient faiths. The most important fact of life on this earth is our common humanity. My greatest wish on this day for the ages is that this incandescent truth will always guide our actions as we continue to march forth in this, the greatest age of discovery ever known.
Most of the sequencing of the human genome by this international consortium has been done in just the last 15 months. During that time, this consortium has developed the capacity to sequence 1,000 letters of the DNA code per second, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. We have developed a map of overlapping fragments that includes 97% of the human genome, and we have sequenced 85% of this. The sequence data is of higher quality than expected, with half of it in finished or near finished form. And all of this information has been placed in public databases every 24 hours, where any scientist with an internet connection can use it to help unravel the mysteries of human biology. Already, more than a dozen genes responsible for diseases from deafness to kidney disease to cancer have been identified using this resource just in the last year.
The method used by Celera has determined the genetic code of 5 individuals. We have sequenced the genome of 3 females and 2 males who have identified themselves as Hispanic, Asian, Caucasian, or African American. We did this sampling not in an exclusionary way, but out of respect for the diversity that is America, and to help illustrate that the concept of race has no genetic or scientific basis. In the 5 Celera genomes, there's no way to tell one ethnicity from one another. Society and medicine treats us all as members of populations, whereas individuals, we are all unique, and population statistics do not apply.
Naturally, with this research, there were social issues, legal issues, and ethical issues. But the scientific implications were enormous. The project has been completed for a long time now, but the analysis of the vast amount of information and data that we recovered will continue to be analyzed for perhaps decades to come. It is that vast of a dataset. Thanks to the Human Genome Project, we can apply this research into diagnosis of diseases, create new energy sources such as biofuels, and, for the topic of this video, we can also look into human migration and origins. The genetic makeup of modern human populations has dramatically changed the understanding, thanks to this research, of who we really are, and it's put a new focus on the commonality of all the human populations that would in the past be classified as human races. The concept of race hasn't just been challenged by this research, but it has been debunked thoroughly. Race as a term has in the past been used to indicate physical characteristics, but it has also been used in other settings to refer to a variety of cultural, national, social, historical, religious, or linguistic differences. But from a scientific perspective, this classification fails in all areas because it does not account for a tremendous variation within different so-called races. Nor does it explain any similarity between these supposedly markedly different groups. The majority of anthropologists, geneticists, biochemists in today's scientific arena frankly find that dividing different populations into distinctive racial categories or classifications not only goes against the inherent biological reality of human population, but is frankly impractical. Thanks to the Human Genome Project, we now understand that racial classification is nothing but an arbitrary exercise. Thanks to this research, we now understand that human variation is by far a lot more nuanced and complex than single traits, such as hair color, chin structure, body length, or skin color would ever suggest. Now, this study does, of course, show a correspondence in genetic makeup with shared geographic origin or heredity. A few of these include features that you would otherwise traditionally use in a so-called racial classification, but the correlations are by far imperfect, and there's a continuous overlapping of genetic variation across all populations. To simplify, While it is true that individuals from the widely separated geographical areas of Europe, Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa may have some distinct genetic patterns, the differences don't just become more difficult to discern, but they become blurred out and disappear as other populations are included.
Without a doubt, this is the most important, most wondrous map ever produced by humankind.
I think there was a great sense of relief that we'd made the story be the sequencing of the human genome. And the final sentence in my statement was, I am happy that today, the only race we are talking about is the human race.
The thing that counts is not the number of genes, but a number of different combinations you can make from them. Because what happens is one gene turns on other genes, turns on other genes, turns on other genes. There's a whole sort of management hierarchy. And the result is that all the possible variants are not added together, but multiplied together to produce the possible number. Take one's facial appearance. We can spot individuals from our friends or family anywhere in the world. We can find them among 6,000 million people. We can actually see this person we know. One's facial appearance is determined by our genes. If you start to work it out, as few as 33 genes will be enough to give each person in the world a unique face. Now, my point is just the enormous range of genetic variety that's possible in human beings with just 30,000 genes.
We as a human species, for whatever reason, seem to be very wired to notice differences amongst people. We're very clued into that, whether it's skin color or hair texture or facial features. We make a lot of that, and we assume that that reflects something much deeper and more significant within. That, in fact, is the wrong conclusion. At the DNA level, the human species is incredibly similar to itself. We're 99.9% the same, and that's regardless of which pair of people I chose to look at. They would still be 99.9% the same.
A surprising amount of human DNA is shared. The only difference between individuals is one letter every 1,200.
Yes, you cannot have a spectrum without two extremes, but when looking at the genetic code, all human populations fall somewhere within the spectrum, and only a select few individuals ever classify for the extreme ends, and a few individuals do not make a population. Hence, the differences that you would classify as racial are actually fundamentally, and provably so, individualistic. Because of the long history of gene flow between populations, human variation is distributed in a continuous fashion, and has never been able to be, nor can it ever be, partitioned into discrete groups. To simplify, populations were never pure in a genetic sense, and divisions of race has never and can never be neatly bounded. Don't just take my word for it. Let me read from an article called Conceptualizing Human Variation, published in Nature in 2004. Race is not being defined or used consistently. Its referents are varied and shift depending on context. The term is often used colloquially to refer to a range of human groupings: religious, cultural, social, national, ethnic, linguistic, genetic, geographical, and anatomical groups have been and sometimes are still called races. In anthropology, the meaning of race became formalized for humans and restricted to units based on biological variation in keeping with general zoological practice. Classifications were based on somatic traits. Race is applied in formal taxonomy to variation below the species level. Substantively morphologically distinct populations or collections of populations occupying a section of a species range are called a subspecies and given a three-part Latin name. In current systemic practice, the designation subspecies is used to indicate an objective degree of microevolutionary divergence. Do any of the human groups called races, including those from traditional anthropology, meet this later criterion? We argue that the correct use of the term race is the most correct taxonomic one, because it has been formalized. Race gains its force from its natural science root. The term denotes natural distinctions and connotes differences not susceptible to change. One is led to ask, therefore, whether everything that is called a racial difference is actually natural. Racial differences carry a different weight than cultural differences. In terms of taxonomic precision and best practice, is it scientifically correct to identify European Americans, Asians, and Pacific Islanders, Han, Chinese, Hispanics, and African Americans of Middle Passage descent as different races? Although individuals may refer to themselves as belonging to a particular race, it is doubtful that this has been done with knowledge of or concern for zoological taxonomy, because the common use of the term has come from socio-political discourse. Individuals learned the race to which they were assigned. Although race and subspecies are usually treated as equivalent, some zoological taxonomists reserve the word race for local breeding populations, with subspecies being geographical collections of populations that are similar or the same in the defining traits. This causes no serious problem to this discussion because the most commonly known anthropological classification of humans is said to consist of races. If Caucasoid is a subspecies, however, then an endogamous village population or ethnic group becomes a so-called race. This illustrates an inconsistency even in biological usage not found in scientific or sociopolitical practice. For example, how often are the Old Order Amish referred to as a race in recent scientific literature? This group of people is a breeding population based on a particular behavioral pattern of mate choice, as opposed to being defined by an anatomical trait complex. Although the subspecies level is formally recognized in taxonomy, it has been criticized. Subspecies were primarily delimited by differences in selected observable morphological traits within a restricted geographical range. In practice, divisions were made based on a few prominent traits, with subsequent variation interpreted in terms of established units. Current systematic theory emphasizes that taxonomy at all levels should reflect evolutionary relationships. For instance, the term Negro was once a racial designation for numerous groups in tropical Africa and Pacific Oceania. These groups share a broadly similar external phenotype. This classification illustrates race as type, defined by anatomical complexes. Although the actual relationship between African Negroes and Oceanic Negroes was sometimes questioned, these groups were placed in the same taxon. Molecular and genetic studies later showed that the Oceanic Negroes were more closely related to mainland Asians. Reading the scientific literature, it becomes pretty apparent that no, race just doesn't have a scientific usage in terms of human beings whatsoever. And as we can see from the example of the Oceanic Negroes and the African Negroes, it becomes pretty apparent that judging based on phenotypes is pretty unscientific. Now we will move on to the second part of this video, where we will talk about the ideas of heredity and intelligence. It is very important to note that there is no single unified definition of the word intelligence, whether you look at the psychological fields or the neurological ones. And this is actually one of the biggest problems we face right off the bat when we are going to explore this subject. Because if you aren't sure of what it is that you want to measure for, how can you be sure that you are accurately measuring it? We can, however, go with a general definition, just to circumvent this problem for now. We will define intelligence as the capacity to process and evaluate information for problem solving. There is, of course, still another problem regarding this. You see, this undoubtedly will always overlap with the concept of knowledge, which is storage and recall of learned information. Is intelligence in part inherited? Well, yes, of course, this is undoubtedly true. However, other environmental, social, and cultural factors also come into play, as well as knowledge. Now, whenever you want to interpret the varying roles of these different factors, it's always confused by a challenge involving in measuring intelligence correctly. Now let's just ignore that we don't even really know what it is we want to measure, as there is no clear unified standard definition. Many attempts at cloaking racism as so-called scientific followed after Darwin publicized his papers on human evolution. Francis Galton and Herbert Spencer are 19th century English thinkers whom believed that superior members of society rose at the top while inferior ones sank to the bottom thanks to so-called social evolution. These views reinforced the false belief that particular groups of people, or races, had quantifiably different intellectual capacities. Now, there is no doubt that intelligence, regardless of how you choose to define it, or whether there are different types of it, it is still true that among individuals there is a varying level of intelligence. However, there has never ever been a successful attempt at objectively measuring these intellectual differences, as any test will inevitably reflect the beliefs and values of a particular cultural group. Several devices have still been developed to measure these so-called intellectual differences, and the most common is the so-called IQ test. It was invented in 1905 by Alfred Binet, and it was modified to become the Stanford-Binet test when it was brought to the United States. It should be noted that the inventors did warn that the test was valid, in their opinion, only when children tested came from similar cultural environments. However, the most common use of the test was actually at the Ellis Island to weed out so-called undesirables and mentally deficient people such as Jews and other Europeans such as Italians and Poles. And even today, the IQ test is widely used for tracking students, for instance in the US educational system. This, of course, has sparked and is still sparking controversy among social scientists and educators. Which brings us to one of the most controversial books on the subject, The Bell Curve: Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life. In this book, Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein argue that research supports the conclusion that race is related to intelligence. They make this claim by utilizing a bell curve statistical distribution, and they place the IQ of people with European ancestry at 100. People of African descent fall below that standard with an average IQ of 90, while people of East Asian ancestry exceed that standard slightly, averaging 103. Now, the implication, according to them, from these findings is that genetic differences correlate to IQ scores. However, there are a couple of very important questions to ask regarding this. You see, if there really are IQ score differences between European Americans and African Americans, then the more European ancestry an African American should have, the higher the IQ score of those should be compared to other African Americans with less European ancestry. However, in a study from 1978 by Scar and Weinberg, it was determined that hundreds of African Americans whose European ancestry was determined through blood testing found no significant relationship between IQ scores and a degree of European admixture. This very strongly suggests that cultural and social factors are more significant variables than the genetic ones. It was found that between African Americans and European Americans, once you controlled for the socioeconomic status and other factors, the difference in IQ was insignificant. Another group of people in Japan who also tend to score lower in IQ tests is mentioned. They are known as the Burakumin. They exhibit no major physical difference in appearance between themselves and other Japanese people, but they have been subject to prejudice and discrimination for centuries in the Japanese society. The correlation of this subjugation and the IQ scores match very closely to other groups that we know have been subjugated throughout history as well in regards to how they test on an IQ score. The indication is undeniable. Socioeconomic factors are relevant. Very relevant, in fact, when accounting for IQ. it was found that educational enrichment programs boost IQ scores quite considerably. Another factor that one has to take into account when arguing about the so-called racial IQ gap is, like I mentioned before, the overlap between these so-called racial groups is enormous. In fact, like I've explained before, when it comes to the racial spectrum, you will only find single individuals at the very ends of that spectrum. You will never ever find entire populations on either end of the spectrum. Entire populations as a whole will always fall somewhere within the spectrum. This overlap is very significant, and it very much complicates any attempt at arguing that any so-called race is intellectually inferior to another, because where do you draw the line? So we've already seen that socioeconomic factors do play a much bigger part, it seems, than any genetic variable. And we've also signified now that even if you want to argue that the genetic variable is somehow still relevant, the fact that any line you draw between so-called races is entirely arbitrary completely invalidates the argument that you could argue that anyone would be genetically inferior because of the group they would supposedly belong to. In the book from 2009 called Intelligence and How to Get It, Richard Nisbett writes about how class differences are much more important than race or heredity in influencing IQ scores. What becomes clear is that previously poor children whom have been adopted into upper-class homes had their IQ scores rise by as much as 18 points. The sheer amount of data to support his case is overwhelming. There is a clear trend that has rapidly progressed upwards when it comes to IQ scores. For instance, if you were to score 100 on an IQ test in 1917, you would probably only score about 73 on a modern IQ test. Meaning that today, the past populations of the world, even in the upper classes, would be considered mentally deficient. Once again, the indications are crystal clear. Societal, cultural, and economic factors are far more important, it seems, than any genetic factor in giving people a so-called edge over anyone else. Besides, any such genetic edge could only be traced back to an individual level, not within a so-called population, because once again, any line you would draw between so-called races would be entirely arbitrary. But why stop there? Why not take a look at the concept of intelligence itself? You see, why would there only be one type of intelligence? I mean, it's bad enough we don't even have a unified standard definition of it, but why one type? We already know how complicated a brain is. We know that some parts of the brain is responsible for behaviors while others are not. As intelligence is an extension of the capacity of the brain, maybe intelligence is far more complicated as a concept than we could ever hope to imagine. What if there are different types of intelligence, and any single IQ test will be far too focused on a specific type of intelligence? This concept is actually explored in two papers, one from 2004 and one from 2012. What becomes clear is that intelligence is not a single characteristic, but is rather a mix of many differing faculties. What becomes clear when you test people for specific mental abilities is that individuals show an incredible variety in their skills, just as they do in their physical appearance. Some are very good at making music. Some people are very good at social interaction. Some are very good at math. And others, like myself, are very spatially gifted and can very easily rotate 3D objects in their mind. Which brings us to the final point. The IQ test in general simply ranks people according to a performance that very easily relate to academic or scholastic problem solving. We already know, as I pointed out in a previous video of mine, that schooling and IQ have a very close correlation. In fact, they have a bidirectional relationship. In conclusion, any attempt to classify humans into so-called separate races, even with the most modern, scientific of classification, will always fall short as these attempts are simply too static and will never be able to encompass the incredible dynamic and wide nature of human interaction, as well as any consequence from environmental and evolutionary forces. Any physical characteristic to be used to distinguish one so-called race from another will form an extremely small part of humans' total genetic makeup. As we've seen, the sheer variation within itself mean that any line you would draw between these populations would be entirely arbitrary, and in many cases even contradictory. There are ways you can classify different groups of human beings across the world. The way this is actually performed by modern science may surprise you, and it is not in any way synonymous with the idea of race. But this is something I plan on discussing in a future video of mine. Instead, I think we will simply be satisfied with what we have already gone through in this video. And I hope you have enjoyed watching this video as much as I have enjoyed making it. Now, before I leave, I would like to remind you to please subscribe to this channel, as well as clicking the bell to make sure that you really are notified. Thank you for watching. Bye.
4. E quante gambe ha un cavallo più una gallina?
4 e 2.
4 and 2. Che fanno?
Camminano.
No. Quante gambe vedi in totale? Quante gambe hanno un maiale, una gallina e una capra?
Ok.
Vabbè. Uè. Vabbè.
Caccia a casa e qua si possono asciugare cose o potremmo pure fare l'armale, ci potremmo mettere l'armale.
Good and gold.
Allora, lei è in mezzo al mare in una piccola barca. C'è una grande tempesta. Nella barca con lei ci sono 2 sacchi. Uno è un sacco pieno di pane e l'altro è un sacco pieno di oro. Tu ti devi salvare. Quale sacco butti?
Ma perché a tirare questi sacchi? Io faccio etto l'oro, un po' zettare l'oro.
He says you can't throw the gold.
Un pane un mangio.
He'd eat the bread.
Ah, un ghetto niente. Un ghetto niente.
Nothing. He wouldn't throw anything.
Giusto? Giusto, vero?
I'm ready. Done. I love table games. May I ask, I thought you were looking for illnesses and contagious diseases here.
Unfortunately, ma'am, it has been scientifically proven that lack of intelligence is genetically inherited, hence contagious, in a way. We are trying to prevent below-average people from mixing with our citizens.
What a modern vision.